everyone, it's Lady Raven, the Wild Witch, and I wanted to apologize because I know we had this event scheduled for, sorry, my hair is a mess today. We had this event scheduled for like 2 weeks ago, but things got crazy and I wasn't able to do it. So here I am today to talk about ancestral veneration. And I wanted to really cover some of the myths of surrounding that, some of the things that you can do and some of the things that you can't do. And I also want to give you some tips for getting started with your practice. And if you already have a practice, a couple of different things that maybe will help you to deepen your practice that you already have. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my comments on here so I can see them. All right. So let's talk about what is ancestor veneration. So ancestor veneration is the ability to work with your ancestors. It's about honoring your ancestors, understanding that you are only here because they came before us. They kind of laid the way for us. And so honoring them in all that we do, because we would not be able to be here if it weren't for them, is essentially what this practice is all about. In terms of spiritually, it's interesting to me that most spiritual traditions will always begin with ancestral veneration as the first stop, and ancestral work as a first stop, because it's one of the safer paths for you to start your ancestral work. And then B, working with your ancestors gives you a foundation, and it also is going to give you the protection you need to step into deeper work when you're working with other spirits, when you're working with deities and totems and all of these other things. It makes it a lot easier if you know you have the support of your ancestors with you, and your ancestors, kind of walking that journey with you. So first of all, let's talk about some myths, right? So a lot of times I hear people say, oh, I don't want to work with my ancestors because I didn't like my family. Number one is you will not be working with grandma or great grandma. So even though a lot of people say, well, this is who I work with, chances are you won't. And the reason for that is those spirits are not ready to be working with you right now. They have, after people pass, there's life processing that needs to happen. There's all kinds of things that need to happen. So the ancestors that are going to be the best for you to work with are probably going to be ancestors that lived about 500 years before you or so. So chances are you can use your grandparents or your parents to connect with those ancestors, but it's really not necessary. You can just tap into basically your blood and connect with the ancestors that you're going to be working with. So I want you to, when you think about ancestor practice, I don't want you to think about the family that you know and you have now. I want you to understand that this is one snapshot of a whole long evolutionary chain that you are descended from. So instead of working at the very front of the chain, which is where you are right here, we're going to work further back in the chain so that you're going to have support from ancestors who are pretty much done with their processing and hopefully who are well at this point. So that is number one thing. I know that a lot of people like to put pictures of grandma and grandpa on the altar, and that's fine. For me, that's a way to connect. It's a way to say, hey, this is my ancestor. And I know that whenever I connect to that picture, I'm not connecting directly to them. I'm using them as a bridge to connect to the previous ancestors that I had. The other thing to know is if you don't like your current family, and if you had, trauma or abuse or anything like that, you should not be working with the images of your current family. That is not where you go with that, because the purpose of it is not to re-traumatize you in whatever happened to you in the past. So the way that I normally view it is I kind of view myself when you're working with trying to figure out who your ancestors are that you're actually going to work with. I would envision myself here, and then I would envision two figures, especially if you've had trauma. I don't want you to visualize mom and dad. I want you to visualize just a female figure and a male figure that represents basically all the moms in your lineage and all the dads in your lineage. So you don't have to work with the ones that you dislike or the ones that caused you harm. And then you envision from behind them, they're going to be people springing out in twos from each one. So as you can imagine, it's almost like a pyramid, right? You're at the center of it, and there's this wave of people behind you, because that's what our ancestry looks like. And so the ancestors that you would call for is for somebody in that sea of people to step forward and try to work with you, because it's not healthy for you to work with your ancestors if you were abused by them. It's not healthy for you to, not with your ancestors, with the images of mom and dad, or even grandma and grandpa, or any relative that was abused, that abused you, or that caused you harm, or that caused you all kinds of other problems. You do not want to work with those images, because the purpose of this is to free yourself and to get stronger, not to keep beating yourself up with previous trauma. So that's number one. So, people who have had trauma, this is one way you can work with it. People who were adopted. If you were adopted, you actually have a couple different options, right? So if you were adopted, you could work with you could do the same thing. Visualize, picture of man and a woman, all the moms in your lineage, all the dads in your lineage, right? And then go back from there and pick somebody to work with. Or you can also, at times, you can work with your adoptive family. And this is the interesting part, I think, about ancestor work, is that when you are adopted by a family, essentially that family signed, especially if it's a legal adoption, right? The family signed on the dotted line in a contract that says, yes, we want you to come into our lineage. We are inviting you to be part of us. What happens at that point, those ancestors in that lineage become your ancestors as well. So if you are somebody who's adopted, you actually have two sets of ancestors you could be working with. You have your set of your, bone blood ancestors, the biological side, but you also have your adoptive ancestors who have welcomed you into their family. So those are different ways that you can work with ancestors in that way. The second thing I want to say is that not all ancestors are well. So this is really key, right? There's a lot of practices out there that says your ancestors can never hurt you. They're awesome. And they are awesome. Don't get me wrong. And they're not going to hurt you willingly, right? But what happens is if you have an ancestor that's still dealing with their crap and they're not at rest, if you start working with that ancestor, they're going to bring all their problems into your life. So this is another reason why we don't work with our recent ancestors. We don't know what state of health they're in. We don't know where they are in their processing. We don't know, if they're remembering what they did in life and they're having regrets, or if they have secrets that they're still processing that maybe nobody knew about. All of those things are still happening for them. We don't want to work with those. So we want to, once again, step back. Once again, 500 years is generally the benchmark that I think is a good benchmark to use. So don't just assume that with an ancestor came to you and says, oh, I'm grandpa, I want to work with you. I wouldn't. I know that my grandparents are well, and they come to me quite often because I've done a lot of work I've done a lot of work to connect with them and just to find out if they were well or not. And they are. But still, when it comes to me doing my heavy duty work, I go beyond that, just because they are still so freshly connected to their lives here. I don't want that bias that's going to happen, right? I want ancestors that have had time to disassociate with that, have a much bigger view of life, of the family line, of everything. And those that can give really broad, very much better advice that is not going to be tainted with their personal experiences, even though if their personal experiences were good. So let's see. Trisha has a question. Such a good, informative video. Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. Very welcome. So that's the number two. So not all of your ancestors are well. So once again, when you start working with ancestors that are more recent, your chances of working with an ancestor who is unwell are much higher. Let's say you have Aunt Jane. Aunt Jane was a sweetie pie. Everybody loved her. She was so sweet. She was your favorite aunt. And you're thinking to yourself, she was a joy to be around in real life. I mean, now that she's passed, I'm sure she's going to be great. No, she's not. Aunt Jane was a complete and total human being. Aunt Jane has had an entire life that she has to evaluate, that she has to work through, all of those things. She is not ready to be an ancestor helper. Even if she was this marvelous, amazing person in life, she is not at the point where she's ready. So just keep in mind, you always want to be working with ancestors that you don't know physically, that you've never met, and that chances are some of your immediate family hasn't met. So this is going to be an ancestor that your great grandmother never met, that your grandmother never met. So those are ancestors that are going to come in because their chances of being well are much, much greater. So that is just an overview idea of which ancestors you really want to work with and which ones you don't. So when you connect with your ancestors, so now let's create an ancestor space, right? So you need a space. And I like to classify ancestor space as an encounter space, right? When you and there's really, let me back up a little bit and explain the differences between those two. So there's two kinds of spaces that we can have. We can have an encounter space, which means we think of it as you build a house for somebody, and then you go to their house to see them. You go to their house to have dinner with them, and you come back, right? And that is considered an encounter space. That altar space belongs to them, and you come to that space a lot of times just on your own to meet them, to talk to them, to sit down, to have a chat, to get advice, and then boom, you leave. And when you leave, that is like their little house. That is their space, which is a lot of times it's also called an honoring altar, which is very different than a working altar. You do not want your everyday working altar to double as your ancestor altar. No, if you're doing that right now, stop that practice, because it's, imagine, here's the way I like to equate it, right? So the ancestor altars for your ancestors, they're sitting there, they're doing their little ancestor thing, they're chilling out, whatever. And if you are now took that space and you made it your working space, it's like you're going to grandma's house and you're saying to her, hey, I need to use this space for something. You need to just kind of go sit in the corner until I'm done. That's incredibly rude. It's your grandmother's house. You wouldn't go there to her and say, you need to go sit over there so that I can do whatever I need to do here at your house. Grandma would say to you, go to your house and do that. And so that is basically that idea, right? So when you have your encounter space, you do not want to be doing your personal work in your ancestral space. Think of it as being their house. So you build the space for them. It's their house. You go there, you meet with them, you sit down, you have coffee, you have dinner, whatever it is you're going to have, and then you leave and you go back to your space to do your work in your own primary working altar. I hope that that makes sense. I met a lot of people who did that because they just felt unsafe working in their own altar. And so they wanted to work in their ancestor altar to have that connection with the ancestors all the time. That is not how that works. And it is actually incredibly disrespectful for you to do that to your ancestors. They love you and all that, but essentially you're infringing in their space and you're trying to take over some of their area to do stuff that is unrelated to them at all. So their altar space has to be their own little space. So the way that you're going to start with that is you're going to start with a white cloth. And, you know, a lot of people will say that you can put any colored tablecloth that you want. And for ancestor altars, I always recommend white. And the reason I recommend that is because white is a very neutral color. It's a very calm color. And since that is your ancestor's house, you're going to have well ancestors that are going to come there. You're going to have unwell ancestors that are going to come there. And color leads to vibration. So you want, the white is a very high vibration color. It reflects back everything. So this is why, you know, it's, you know, this is the white. And so you have all the vibrational spectrum sitting in that color. So it is a very high vibration. It's a very supportive color for your ancestors. You're going to want a candle, generally a white candle. Everything I put on my ancestor altar is generally white, unless I'm putting like a stone or a piece or something for them. So you're going to put a white altar cloth on it. And then you're going to put the white candle. That is basically going to be it for you. Every time you talk to your ancestors, you light that candle, right? That candle becomes a means of communication between you and your ancestors. The third thing I'm going to recommend is that you have an offering bowl. So you can give them offerings. A lot of times the offering may be a prayer that you may write out on a piece of paper and put there. It may be some food. It may be a drink. It may be some flowers, whatever you feel like giving to your ancestors. And it's really good for you to give your ancestors an offering at least once a month. When you're first starting, you want to do that a little bit more often than that. But after it's well established, you probably want to be doing it about once a month. The other thing that I have in mind is an incense censer. And you want to make sure you have that there so that when you light that, incense can be an offering to the ancestors as well. So you sit down, you light that, you have this beautiful flowery scent. Depending on your ancestors, I always recommend people going with calmer scents. I recommend them going with like flowery scents and all of that. If you know your ancestors really, really well and you've gotten, you know, really good at it, and they say, well, they want a spicy incense, like a cinnamon or something like really hot, you can do that at that point. But I would not recommend starting with that. I would recommend starting with very neutral things until you start getting the hang of it. And so basically what you want to do, you want to sit down in your ancestor altar for at least 10 minutes. You want to light the candle and you want to talk to your ancestors like you're talking right now. Tell them what's going on in your life. Talk to them about, you know, things that you need help with, things that don't be just asking, right? It needs to be kind of a two-way street. You don't want to be that friend that always needs something from you anytime she comes over, right? So you want to be connected to your ancestors in a very balanced way. So you may sit down and say, you know, I'm really struggling with this at work. I have a situation with this coworker that I don't get along and I don't know what to do. Maybe you guys could send me some guidance. Perfect. And then the next time you meet with them, you say, hey, I just want to say thank you for everything that you do for me, for, you know, for working with me. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you this as an offering right now. This is from my heart to yours to acknowledge everything that you have done for me. And then you give an offering. It's always important that you don't do the asking and the offering in the same ceremony. When you go to ask for something, when you go to petition, which is what we call the asking is a petition, you go petition something, that is one ceremony. When you give your offering, that is a separate ceremony. Okay, you don't want to combine those two. And so what you're going to do is, I would say if you are going to do a petition in a month, you always want to have at least one offering ceremony every month. No matter what, if you have petitions or no petitions, you're going to offer them something. If you have petitions, you want to do your petition ceremony, and then you want to do your offering ceremony whenever it is that you do it. For my ancestors, I generally find it appropriate to either do it on the new moon or the full moon, either one, whichever one works for you. If I'm doing a petition on one, so if I'm doing a petition, I'll probably do it on the new moon, and then I'll do an offering for them on the full moon. So that's kind of different ways that you can work with that. In the beginning, if you want to connect with your ancestors and maybe give an offering like once a week, once every couple of days, just to start building that connection, right? The more you connect, the more you sit at that altar, the more you connect and you talk to them, the quicker that connection is going to come. And then as you start feeling that you've built this connection, then you can start meditating, you know, do a meditation where you go in to try to meet one of your ancestors face to face. There's plenty of guided meditations online that you can find. If you signed up for my meditation class, there's a library of a few meditations in there, and one of them is connecting with your ancestors. So you can use that meditation. You can even use that once a week to go in and say, hey, you know, let me connect. Let me see what they have to say this week, right? You don't want to be going in and meditating every day, right? That's not something you want to do. But you want to maybe, you know, once in a while. I would generally say that I do my meditation probably about once or twice a month. But I give offerings and I go to the ancestor altar and I speak to them much more often than that, right? So that's kind of like how I balance mine out. Does anybody have any questions about working with their ancestors and different ways that you can incorporate that into your everyday practice? And as you know, people post their questions, I'm going to continue to speak. So working with your ancestors is really one of the best ways to get yourself started in this kind of exploration, right? Because when you find a lot of questions that I get from people a lot of times, also, let me cover this before I continue, is how do you know if you're working with an ancestor that's well or an ancestor that's unwell? So that's a very good question. So a lot of times when you connect and an ancestor comes to you, there's going to be ancestors are going to communicate with you through emotions, through feelings, through, you know, visual images. Sometimes they'll speak, sometimes they won't. It'll vary. But when they come to you, there's going to be this overall energy, right? So if you connect with them and you see them in front of you, and if you start feeling uneasy, you start feeling like, there's something about this that just doesn't jive. There's something about this that I don't know. It feels unsettled. Just disconnect immediately. Just take a step back and say no. And you can, in the middle of a meditation, if that happens, put up some shielding, put up a barrier between you and them and say, "Ooh, you're not ready to work with anybody yet. Thank you so much for coming and for acknowledging me. I acknowledge you, but you are not ready to work with anybody. And I'm definitely not ready to work with you." And this is kind of how I would do that. Let's see, we have a question. So just sitting and chatting with them can be an everyday thing, but meditation with them and offering should not be daily, right? It can be whatever you want to. I personally would not meditate daily, but I know a lot of people that do give offerings daily. You can do that. You can give daily offerings. It's going to speed up that connection with them that you have. But if you don't want to do it daily, if you don't have the time to do it daily, that's fine. Do it as often as you can in the beginning, because the goal when you first start an ancestor practice is to really connect with them and to have that solid foundation. And really what you want to do is you want to know what that ancestral energy feels like, right? You want to know, the more you sit at that ancestral altar and you call your ancestors to come forward, they're going to come forward, and you're going to start feeling a familiarity with that energy. So that, let's say you are out somewhere and all of a sudden you're feeling vulnerable, you need help, and you say, yo, ancestors, I need protection. You're immediately going to know the minute that energy comes around you, because it's going to feel the same way that it feels when you're sitting in front of your ancestral altar. So it's a matter of building that connection so that you can recognize them and they can recognize you, even when you're not sitting at that altar. I hope that makes sense. So this practice is really a great way for you to start your spiritual journey. If you're just getting started now and you're thinking, well, what gods am I going to work with? What totems am I going to work with? I would encourage you, I would invite you to start thinking about starting with your ancestors first. And then once you have that down and you have a solid foundation, then exploring from there. And the reason for it is, I know that there's a lot of people that says the universe is beautiful and nothing's ever going to hurt you. That is a big fat lie. Okay. I'm going to tell you right now, there are good things and bad things out there. You don't, until you get to know and understand what something feels like, you can have a spirit come to you and say, yo, I'm your spirit guide. I'm awesome. You're awesome. We're going to work together. This is great. Until you have worked enough with spirit energy where you can tell and say, ooh, that guy is not he's not telling me the truth. He's not, this is not what I think it is. You don't have that discernity in the beginning, right? You can then, at that point, you can pull out. I've seen a lot of people who go straight into working with any kind of, entities that come to them in the beginning, and they end up with pretty nasty attachments. So I would say be very cautious when you begin this process. Starting with your ancestors is a safe way to start. And make sure that every time you sit there, when you put your intent forward, your intent is, I want my well ancestors, the ones that are good, the ones that are healed, the ones that have a lot of light. My grandfather used to call it the light-bearing ancestors, which are the ones that have a lot of light. That will come forward to you. And this is why one of the things that we offer them as we work with them is a candle, because that adds to their light, right? You're offering light to them in exchange for everything that they have done for you, basically. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that right now we're still in the best time to work with ancestors. You probably have from now till the end of November, the veil's still going to be pretty thin for you to do your work. So keep that in mind as you move forward in that. And I wish you well in your ancestor practice. And I hope that you connect with your ancestors and meet some really great guides that are going to help you along in your spiritual development. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining. All right, bye-bye.